Welcome back, Watt Warriors. It's Roy, the Air Pro Coaching, coming to you with post-race and event review. So a lot of times we can take those files after a race or an event and learn a lot from it. A lot of people are reluctant to use power or see the value of power in a race or an event, but in all reality, that is the most valuable time to use it. So what we can do is after the fact, we can do a post-race review or event review and learn a lot of things from that. So we're going to use some of our athletes who did the state time trial this past weekend and show you how we use that analysis to build future workouts to save time and keep them from making the same mistakes. So an example of this is a lot of times we'll do an event or a race and we'll experience cramping. So a lot of people have these issues with cramping, and they'll conclude that that's from hydration or electrolytes or something to that effect. And that may be the case, but a lot of times, 9 times out of 10, when I go back and do a post review, it shows that the intensity that they were riding at was a lot greater than the intensity their body is used to. So example, if you're able to ride at 22 miles an hour on average, or average 200 watts, and then all of a sudden you want to average like 27 miles an hour and 300 watts, you're not going to be able to do that. Now, your mental capacity may be able to do that during a race because your adrenaline's pumping and you push hard, and you're going to push to a point of failure or breaking where the body just says, hey, we can't sustain this anymore. So the body has to, you can pull off a 10 or 20%. Going for the fence is like hitting a home run in a race, but to go above that is very difficult, and that's what we can do by looking at a post-ride review. You can, if you don't have this post-ride analysis of the intensity that you rode at, maybe you keep trying to drink more and add more electrolytes, start drinking pickle juice and all these weird things to try to remedy the problem, but the actual solution is you're just riding too hard, and we see that quite a bit. That happens often. So let's take one of our athletes from this weekend. So this chart measures the force on the pedals and cadence. It's called a quadrant analysis. So the quadrant analysis measures force and cadence. So the velocity and then the force, and then it tells us how you produce that power. And telling us how you produce that power gives us insight into maybe what you've been doing right or what you've been doing wrong. So what we did is we took our example athlete. An example athlete is one who does it well. So they're the marker, they're the person that we want to emulate or reference. So our athlete here is a very good time trialist, and as you can see, they spent about 27.5% of their time riding at high force, low cadence. So high force, lots of force, low cadence, pushing a little bit harder gear. They spend majority of their time, 65.7%, at high cadence, high force. So they're spinning, but they're still producing lots of force. And these two areas are the key areas for a time trial. So these are very specific, and this is the area that we want to see. Typically, if we see somebody at high cadence, high force, 50% or greater, they tend to have a good time trial. So this is something that we're going to use this as our model to compare some of our files from this past weekend. So if we look to our first athlete, they spent 67% of their time in low force, low cadence. So 67% of the time, and that's obviously well outside, the target of high force, low cadence, and then high cadence, low force. So that this is very telling in the sense that this particular athlete was spending, they were spending a lot of time in a lower force and a lower cadence, meaning they weren't on top of the gear. So they're in this hard cadence or hard gear, but they weren't able to push it with enough force. So and so that would be our assumption, that they were in too big of a gear, and that either they didn't have enough strength to push that gear, or for some reason they just weren't really getting on that gear or pushing it. So we're going to make the assumption that they overgeared on this one. So they overgeared. And then if we look at their pacing, so the next chart is looking at their pacing. And if we look at their pacing was 168 watts on the outbound, and then on the return trip was 158 watts. Now, for this particular time trial, the headwind was on the second half. So the hardest part of the course was on the second half, and that's where you want the greatest power. So the first half, a little less power because you had the tailwind to push you along. What they did is they pushed really hard on the outbound, but when the return trip, they stalled out. They weren't able to produce enough power. They were trying to muscle the gear, and that's where we see them not on top of the gear and producing not enough force. So low force, low cadence for this athlete. So what would we do to remedy this? So what we would do is we would say, hey, you can try to push like at 83, 86 RPM, and need to apply more force, or you can go ahead and shift into an easier gear, higher cadence with more force. So that's what we would tend to practice in training. So we would set up some intervals that were maybe at a lower gear, applying more force, or we would try a higher cadence and more force. So that's kind of the art of coaching, trying to figure out which would work, and then designing some intervals around that to see if we can gain some improvement for their next time trial. Now, our next athlete, they did a really, really good job pacing. So this chart shows us their pacing, and their pacing based on power and cadence and speed. So what we'd like to see is that on the second half, which was the hardest part of this of time trial, because they had a headwind on the way back, they put out their most power. So they did. You can see that their power improved, and we see a higher watts on the return trip. Now, we wanted to take a deeper dive because obviously their pacing was, unlike the other athlete who their pacing was a little off, and their power production, this athlete, their pacing was on, but let's take a look at their power production. How did they produce this power? And then, so if we look at this, their power predominantly was low force, high cadence. So they were hitting a higher cadence, but they weren't producing enough force. Okay, so remember, we either want low cadence, high force, or high force, high cadence. So we want more force to produce more watts. So this athlete had low force, high cadence, not a good recipe for ideal power production. So what we do is we looked at it, their cadence was 92 RPM. So what we'd want them to do is either improve that cadence to higher cadence, 100 RPM, which would push more force at the same gear. So if they're in the same gear, we say, hey, you're riding 92 RPM at that gear. Now we need 100 to go higher cadence, higher force. Or gear down and then push more force, which potentially could be lower cadence, higher force. So there's a little look at the cadence. It was 90 RPM, wasn't producing enough force, either more force on the pedals or gear down to about 85 RPM and see if that gives us enough force to produce the power. So, and that brings me to a point. Some people can do lower gear, higher force for long periods of time. Some people need to have higher cadence, higher force for longer periods of time. So higher cadence, higher force, lower cadence, harder, more force. So again, that's a different way of producing the power. So in training, we would go ahead and see if that made any changes. And then the last athlete that I wanted to bring up, I broke this athlete down into 4 segments. So we took their time trial, their event, and we broke it into 4 segments. And you can see that the first 2 segments produced the greatest amount of power, which was with the tailwind. And then on the return trip, their power dropped. And they're steadily decreasing in power. So their power is steadily going down as they're progressing through the time trial. So the other thing that we want to look at is cadence. Cadence stayed relatively the same, stayed at around 91, 92, 93 RPM, while power was reducing. So their cadence stayed the same, power was reducing. And then we want to look at what they did with the percentage of heart rate to power, or decoupling. So in the beginning, when they got up to power, they pushed really hard. Decoupling was high, 9.34%. Then the decoupling started to get under control at 4%. We want to see 5% or lower. And then in the second segments, you can see that they started to settle into the gearing. They started to They started to process lactic acid in their system better and just settle into a good time trial effort. So fitness wasn't really an issue for this athlete. So sometimes fatigue could be caused by fitness, and in this case, fitness wasn't really the issue in this, or we would see greater decoupling rates. Now let's take a deeper dive and find out how they produce that power. And what I did is I broke this quadrant analysis down into 4 segments. So the others, I just looked at the overall how they produce power. This one I broke down into 4 segments. Now, the first segment, they produce power at 50% high force, high cadence, and then their second highest was high force, low cadence. So they were producing power in those target ranges, and they started out doing that very well. Then they ended up switching that to a little less on the high force, high cadence, still holding it in there. But then they're starting to mash the gear a little bit, or push a little bit lower gear, but high force. Still, a majority of the power is being produced in those target ranges. Now, the big change happens when they turn around. When they turn around into the wind, they start doing low force, low cadence. So they start to get behind on the gear. They're not on top of the gear, and they're trying to force it, which is lower force, lower cadence. And then every now and then we're starting to see them try to hold higher cadences or higher force. So they're struggling with like spinning, and then mashing into a gear and getting over geared and not on top of the gear. So we want them on top of the gear, either high force, low cadence, or higher cadence, higher force. And again, we're measuring that cadence as it relates to the power. So we're digging in deeper versus just looking at overall average speed and effort and the time. So how do we use this? So taking this data, one, it helps us show the example of what we're looking for. Like if we take our modeled athlete who's a really good time trials, we know that they do 67% in high force, high cadence. We know that the remainder of it is lower cadence, higher force. So if we overlay that onto these 3 athletes, it gives us a target for them to improve their time trialing. So yeah, maybe their pacing was right, or maybe their power was right, or maybe fitness was on, right? Maybe fitness was on, but the way they're producing the power can be improved. So now what we'll do is take this data, show it to them, and then we will go and produce intervals on or workouts that will teach them to produce power, either high cadence, high force, or low cadence, high force. We always want a lot of force in a time trial, and that is clearly the model for winning, because if you take our modeled athlete, that's what they're doing, and they're producing some of the fastest times in the US today. So that's what we want to do. We want to take an example file, compare what we're doing, and try to emulate that. Now, how do we do that? We build training that does that elicits that same response. So if I go out there and I say, hey, I want you to do 5 minutes in a big gear at high force, like really push the force on that, 5 minutes or 3 to 5 minutes, high force, high force, low cadence, and let's see what that does. And then I'll go back and compare that in the quadrant analysis. Are we getting the power in that zone? And then I'll say, hey, what I want you to do now is to do some 5-minute efforts with high force, high cadence. So really get on the cadence, really get on the force. Maybe it's an all-out effort, maybe it's at threshold, whatever the case may be on the intensities. But again, we want to try to produce high cadence, high force efforts, and then run it through a quadrant analysis. Are they doing it right? So this is how we can teach athletes who are not with us from afar, or of all different abilities, and really dig in deep to see how they're producing power. This is not something I'd be able to do riding next to them. This is not something I would be able to do other than if I can quantify it through a power meter. And so we can do this outside of these examples. We can do this in an event. How did an athlete who is doing a triathlon, how did you produce that power? Were you mashing the gear and overtaxing your muscle system so that way when you went to the run, you were cramping and you had some issues? Or were you spinning? Were you spinning a higher cadence, higher force to produce the power for that duration of your event, allowing your muscles not to fatigue, but resting more in your aerobic system? Now, if we design intervals where we're forcing that aerobic system to work, and we see decoupling, your heart rate start to decouple away from that at higher RPMs and at higher force, then that means we need to work on that fitness, so that fitness matches the RPMs, or that higher force, higher cadence. Again, that's another way to use it. So there's a lot of different ways to use this information, and that's what we do on a post-ride review, on a post-race. Races are the best to review because during that's why a lot of people are training either for a race or an event to achieve something. Even if you're just doing fitness, for fitness we can do the same review. We can give you the same insight, the same data, the same information to improve your training. And it's all about this: improve your training so that the time you spend on the bike or the time you spent training goes towards improving, and you don't have wasted efforts. You don't have wasted time. If we didn't have this analysis, then they would just go to try to become stronger, and stronger, but maybe it's not strength or fitness that's needed. Maybe it's efficiency or producing power in a specific way, or maybe it's changing your gear. Maybe it's bigger gears. Maybe it's elliptical chain rings. Maybe it's a lot of different things. Maybe it's their fit. Maybe it's their position on the bike. All of that can play into this and building a more efficient training, efficient pedaling style, more efficient power production. Okay, and that's all we have for you. I made this into a blog, so you can check it out on our AeroPro coaching website. You can check out the blog if you want to review this and read it and check out the charts. But we also wanted to do this as a video, feeling that it would be easier to explain through the video. So I hope you gained some insight. I hope this helps with your training. If you have questions, hit us up on Facebook and Instagram. We will gladly answer any of those for you. That's all we have for you from AeroPro Coaching. Up your watts.